but he was certainly different. Some found this liberating, others found it irritating. For me, it became rapidly an intellectual oasis. However important the seminars were to my education, they pale in importance to Krzysztof's invitation to visit, in only the second semester of my graduate studies, the Institute for Human Sciences as a junior visiting fellow. Since it was only my first year in the program, it was clearly far too early for me to be given a fellowship, but there was an open spot, so Krzysztof offered it to me. So in one fell swoop, I was taken out of a rather ordinary American academic program and thrown into a remarkable intellectual world that, to risk a cliche, forever shaped the way that I perceived the world. The transformations of 1989 still underway in Europe. IWM at the time was the site of a dizzying variety of discussions about history, economic transformation, social revolution, and yes, even philosophy, that had become suddenly and powerfully animated by contemporary events. Having turned to philosophy through phenomenology, and thanks to Erzieher Kohak, my understanding of phenomenology shaped through an intense engagement with the thought of the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, I even felt that I had some stake in the questions under debate, as opposed to being a simple American intellectual tourist watching the show. My experiences during those first 6 months at IWM also revealed to me something about Krzysztof, something important about Krzysztof, as an intellectual in general, and a philosopher in particular. I discovered that there was a reason why narrow concerns about the mechanics of academic advancement were absent in the seminars back in Boston. Krzysztof was operating under very different assumptions about the institutional possibilities of intellectual life. He was convinced it was possible, and together with the rest of the leadership at IWM, showed that it is in fact possible, to carve out spaces in which one can offer the requisite time, freedom, and independence for a genuine exchange of ideas, an authentic cultivation of perspectives. I encountered in IWM a place that suspends just enough the more pernicious effects of the rank divisions among junior and senior faculty, as well as the social isolation of academic from non-academic intellectuals or researchers from policymakers, opening the way for often unexpected patterns of intellectual cooperation and community. Anyone plagued by doubts that there is any room left in the academic world for the creation of communities, even if transitory, where ideas are actually thought through in a spirit of honest discovery and creativity, but at that time only find a powerful source of inspiration in IWM, and still do to this day. At the same time, it began to become clear to me, clarity that only grew over the years, that Krzysztof's commitment to IWM was not a function of choosing a practical at the expense of a theoretical path through intellectual life. It's certainly true that he spent an enormous amount of time and energy on the administrative and political side of things at IWM. But at the same time, he always remained in tune with the manner in which a whole host of apparently different kinds of discussions, debates, and controversies were relevant to a basic, fundamental call to reflect on the meaning of the human condition. Krzysztof, in other words, always remained a philosopher, even as he was pulled, at times willingly but sometimes not, into the politics of his native Poland, or into the endless work of securing the position and clout of IWM in the Viennese and Austrian landscapes of influence. Though there are many differences in both situation and temperament, I believe that Krzysztof shared a great deal in common on this score with Patočka, another genuine philosopher consistently drawn out of his books to address a more public need for reflection. Both men were, in ways that are far too uncommon, genuine Europeans, each a patriot, Poland and Czechoslovakia respectively, but at the same time deeply committed to the spirit of Europe as a task, and as yet to be realized ideal. Krzysztof liked to tell the story of a visit to Prague when Patočka personally took him on a tour of the city. I've often reflected on this story since learning of Krzysztof's death, since it seems to me so rich in promise. The aging philosopher, not long before his own death, leading the younger through the streets of a decaying ancient capital with its ghosts of empires and wars, revolutions and defeats, reflecting what Europe was and what it could be. It's easy to romanticize this too, of course. But it is clear that together these two intellectuals represent an important form of a specifically philosophical calling, for which reflection is something that is pursued in order to shape the world in accordance with its potential, not to avoid it with a facile critical disdain. So the intensity of the seminars, the introduction to a genuinely cosmopolitan philosophical life, a vibrant sense of taking part in an emerging understanding of history as it unfolds, all this was pretty heady stuff for a first-year graduate student. It made ideas something astonishingly concrete, but also something personal. Or rather, it brought to the fore how ideas are in fact inseparable from concrete existence, from the lives that we actually live. The lesson is a simple one, but not at all easy to teach. The concreteness of ideas also means that philosophy, if in the end this is what we want to call a life of ideas, is not always an easy thing. For it often becomes entangled in our self-delusions, our unfounded hopes, our vanities and passions. More, it means that ideas are tied up with our history, including everything in our history that is painful. I learned something about this during a seminar co-taught by Krzysztof and an older scholar, whom I would respect I will not name. The seminar was on the work of the important but controversial legal theorist and philosopher Carl Schmitt. Krzysztof had only recently discovered Schmitt at the time and was working through the relevant text for this characteristic group. In the course of the seminar, however, it became clear that the older scholar in question had no interest in Schmitt as a philosopher. His aim in teaching the seminar was solely to discredit Schmitt as a direct response to the popular revival that Schmitt's work was enjoying at the time, especially with regard to his critique of democracy. Looking back many years later, I believe that this interest in attacking Schmitt was rooted in a profound sense of betrayal. The scholar was of roughly the same generation as Schmitt's and considered him to be nothing more than a traitor whose work and very name should be greeted with nothing but contempt. The students, including myself, were rather irritated by this attitude, and what we took then to be dismissive and shallow criticisms offered up by the scholar, all of which contrasted so strongly against Krzysztof's intellectual honesty and penetrating engagements with the text. At the time, I took to heart, and still do, Krzysztof's oft-repeated principle, learned from his own teacher, Michalski als, that one can only truly understand a philosophical position if one first assumes, however temporarily, that it is true. This is not simply a matter of intellectual generosity, but of a necessary act of imagination that is integral to the very dynamic of human understanding. But such understanding is in the end precisely human, entangled in a web of human affairs, which means that to pursue it has its risks. In the case of this seminar, the risk flowered into outright hostility, which threatened to undermine the integrity of the exercise. I take the following to be a basic truth, one that I first learned to see as a student of Krzysztof's. Any commitment to ideas is of one piece with a commitment to the trust, confidence, and respect of others, because real thinking is a potentially dangerous risk. This means that a key part of education must be the conscious cultivation of a willingness to be flexible, forgiving, open to seeing why it is that we argue what we do, believe in what we believe, despite how messy the reasons are. I try to be sensitive to this basic truth in my teaching and advising, but it has perhaps proven most valuable when grappling with the many disappointments and contradictions of academic life, as well as keeping the joys and successes in perspective. For all the narrowness, pettiness, and absurdity wrought by academic professionalization that Nietzsche mocks so well is still with us. And the university as an idea, as a purpose, is, I would argue, very much in crisis. A crisis that perhaps represents one of the most important challenges we face with regard to the contemporary spiritual world. Yet for all that, the game is not up. We should always temper our expectation by realizing that what is at stake in these questions is being experienced in a manifold of very human encounters with a legacy of ideas, with the vocation of the scholar, and with the hopes and desires of each of us. And there is, I believe, always something of value even in the most limited, passion-ridden, difficult, and absurd of our encounters with one another. And I say that as a chair of the Department of Philosophy at the university. In the end, I believe this is just the kind of awareness that Krzysztof expresses on a more sophisticated philosophical register in his book, which I'll turn to just in a moment. And by extension, why Nietzsche became such an important philosopher in his eyes. How else should we read a chapter with the title, Reason Which Hurts? This deeply personal book, on almost every page, expresses profound urgency of existence, of the potential for life to break free from its fetters, and the pain and suffering that must entail. And not just for the great, for those who seem to be running the world, but for each of us, each life that's a being in time, a being reading together the fragile fact of things. There are, of course, aspects of Krzysztof's personality, intellectual and otherwise, that I never understood. The question of religious faith always represented a certain divide between us, one that sometimes had an impact, never negative, but at times ambiguous, on our philosophical relationship. A couple of years ago in conversation, I made a comment to the effect that the past is full of forgotten lives. The overwhelming majority of those who have lived become part of an anonymous mass that constitutes a fundamental feature of the specifically human past. I had meant to say something about the frailty of human existence, of its radical dependence on a capacity to remember that tragically cannot possibly succeed. I meant to express with that something of a strange beauty. But Krzysztof simply rejected the very idea. No one for him is ever forgotten. Everyone counts for all eternity. The discussion was inconclusive and dissatisfying, I think, for both of us. I remain quite certain that I will be forgotten. But I will always remember Krzysztof Michalski, the Erzieher, the deepest gratitude and respect, and I will miss him as well. They always say that the best way to honor your teacher is to critique his work. I'm not going to do that tonight. It'll take too long. But I'm going to lay the foundation for critique. So maybe you'll see where it's going when the foundation's in. So this is part 2 of my remarks. And it's about the book. So I'm going to make you work on it. But there's food afterwards, so there's an exchange. So The Flame of Eternity, Krzysztof's book, is about Nietzsche. It is organized around a reflection on time as a central theme in Nietzsche's thought, with a broader aim of pursuing a more general reflection on how the question of time, of what time is, in turn illuminates essential aspects of the human condition. Krzysztof shows us how the thread of the problem of time binds together the basic concepts of Nietzsche's thinking: nihilism, value, knowledge, life, history, will to power, among others. The reflection culminates in what is perhaps the most difficult of Nietzsche's ideas, that of the eternal recurrence of the same, which is the subject of the last essay in the book, chapter 9, its longest and most complex chapter. My intent here is to try to explain what I take to be the guiding idea of Krzysztof's book, its basic philosophical gesture, which is enacted through an interpretation of Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence of the same. To do this, I will first comment on 2 ideas that are essential to any reflection on eternal recurrence in Nietzsche. These 2 ideas are nihilism and the will to power.